Hello and welcome to The Third Rail. I'm Sarah. Tonight we have a feature episode on feminism. Yes, International Women's Day has come and gone, but we think this issue is important enough to talk about more than once a year. So here I am with Erin Goff and Rachael Jacobs. Erin is the author of a book for young adults called The Flywheel and the soon-to-be-released Amelia Westlake. She is also a lawyer. Rachael is a community activist, a columnist for the Huffington Post and a lecturer at Western Sydney University. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start broadly with a heavy topic, which is that of feminism, intersectional identity and identity politics. What I wanted to ask, and Rachael, I thought I'd ask you first, is whether as a society we are now too focused on the issue of identity politics to the detriment of what some people might discuss or describe as the real bread and butter issues like climate change, housing affordability, cost of living. What do you think?
Well, firstly, those issues do affect women adversely, particularly poor women. So those are actually feminist issues in themselves. But, you know, one of the things when people say, oh, we're too caught up in identity politics, is they assume that that's not a real issue, that doesn't have bearing on someone's lives. And as we know, for young women in particular, you can't be what you can't see. So the representation of women, that's vitally important. How women identify as feminists and as women, that's hugely important. Women of colour, like myself, needing to be heard, you know, that's vitally important as well. We can't have a say on addressing poverty, climate change, inequality, if we don't have representation and if we aren't able to speak for ourselves and say, based on my experience, this is exactly what I think. And the other thing is people who ask us not to talk about identity politics, they're usually the ones who like to pigeonhole us most. So it's usually white people who ask me where I'm from and, you know, putting me in that box that says not a real Australian woman. So I think you get pigeonholed whether you want to or not. So it's about time we were able to speak for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's sort of what you've said actually raises a sort of subtopic, I guess. And Erin, I was going to ask you about this, which is the issue about whether or not, whether you think it's enough for us to be talking about diversity, increased diversity on our screens, in the arts, in politics, in business, or do we need something more in order to achieve true equality between the genders and broadly, I suppose, between different identity groups?
Look, I mean, I certainly think when you're talking about representation in arts and in our culture, it's certainly not enough. When you're talking about representation and diversity in those other areas, in business and I guess in industries, I mean, they're really the structures that we do need diversity in. When it comes to representation, I think in culture, it certainly, I think it very much depends on the way you do it in terms of the value of it, because tokenism can be an issue. But I also think that while it's not enough to have people represented in culture and say, for example, on our television screens, it's not nothing. We heard what Gina Davis had to say when she was in Sydney a few years ago. Oh, sorry, not a few years ago. She was here a couple of weeks ago. And what she has done, she's actually established a research institute.
I love Gina Davis.
Isn't she great?
She's great.
It's called See Jane. And the idea is if a woman sees somebody on the screen being able to do something, then she'll feel like she can do it herself. And some interesting research has come out of the work that Gina Davis has done. She's found that the more television girls watch, the less self-esteem they have. As opposed to boys, where the more television they watch, the higher their self-esteem and also the more sexist they are. Because if you look at the representation of women on screens, there's not as many women on screen. Women aren't as well represented in, for example, professions like being doctors and lawyers on television. And a really interesting anecdote that they had a research paper on was about the spike in participants in national archery competitions in the States, female young girls in archery competitions after the Hunger Games came out.
All right.
So you kind of, you've got that direct response to feeling inspired to see yourself on the screen being able to do something and therefore feeling like you can embrace that in your own life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly for me anyway, and it's something that I read and I can't remember who said it, but I think sometimes when it's easy for, say, predominantly white men to cry about identity politics and say, oh, what a waste of time, all we ever do is whinge about it. And it's all very well and good when you look like the way power structures expect you to look. But when you don't look in that way, it's a real issue. And I certainly find personally for me, I walk into a room not seeing my colour or my gender. I'm just who I am. But other people see me in that way. So I don't know, Rachel, if you have a similar response.
Oh, constantly. You know, what I referred to before, you know, where are you from and things like that, and you're exoticized, you know, for the way you look. And just as a side note, we're recording this on Harmony Day. Now, Harmony Day, I'm a teacher, so have partaken in Harmony Day pretty much everywhere I've taught. And it's just tokenised to the extreme, you know, it's about food and culture. But going back to the stories, you know, Erin, you're a writer and do some great representation of women. So I don't think it's just TV, though, that's the culprit. So there's this great video where children's books were put on the microscope, and all the children's books that didn't feature women or where women didn't talk were removed from the shelves of a library. And it was depressing what was left on the shelf. And once again, you know, what we're asking young women to aspire to, we actually have to show them. We actually have to show them that that's possible.
That's right. And I've found, in my experience as a young adult writer, it's something that young adults really appreciate, seeing themselves represented. My book, The Flywheel, has a gay protagonist, and the key reason I wrote it was because I wanted to write the book that was not available when I was young. There are certainly more books with gay protagonists out there than there were, but certainly not representative of, you know, the population that we have. And it's something really valuable, I think, to see yourself and a potential identity being legitimised in that way. Someone's actually said, look, this story is worth telling and it's worth publishing and worth, you know, distributing. So that can be extremely validating. And I think particularly, you know, you talked about children's books. I think that at that time of people's lives, they're really developing their ideas of what the norms are and what their expectations are. And it's really important that we don't cut off their opportunities kind of unconsciously.
Yeah, no, I agree.